Chapter 4. Early the following morning, Bob found Will in the barn, where he'd slept in the hay beside his horse. The old trainer nodded to himself. He'd heard Will get up in the middle of the night and leave the cabin, and he'd guessed where he'd gone. Knowing that Will desperately wanted to care for his horse, Bob allowed him to check the wound for any sign of inflammation or infection. Thankfully, there was none. Then he supervised the ranger as he put a new bandage on. The flap of torn skin had been neatly stitched back in place, and now there was only a slight flow of blood to be staunched. When that was done, he dropped a hand onto Will's shoulder. "Come on now," he said. "Breakfast, and then we'll talk." They sat outside Bob's kitchen in the early morning sunshine. But the sun did nothing to raise Will's spirits. He sipped his coffee without his usual relish and morosely broke pieces off a sweet roll on the platter in front of him. "I won't lie to you, young fellow," Bob said. "Tug's hurt bad. It's a terrible wound. It's much worse than a simple bite. The wolf hung on when he bit into him, shaking his head and pulling with all his body weight, and he cut deep into the muscles and tendons." "But will he recover?" Will asked, and his heart sank as the old horse trainer hesitated, his gaze sliding away. "I hope so, but we won't know for 4 or 5 days at the earliest." Bob saw the fear in the young man's eyes and hurried to give him what little reassurance he could offer. "He's not going to die, Will. He'll recover in that sense, but the leg may never mend properly. I just don't know. I'll do all I can for him, and he's a strong and healthy horse." "So we just have to sit and wait?" Will said. But Bob was shaking his head before Will finished the sentence. "I have to sit and wait. You've got work to do back at Redmont." Bob eyed the young man shrewdly. In truth, he had no idea if Will had pressing work to do back at Redmont. The probability was high that he did, as rangers were constantly being called on. But he knew that the worst thing for Will would be to sit here brooding for the next 4 or 5 days. It would be better to get him back to work, to take his mind off the situation here. Will stared at his hands on the table. He did have a lot of urgent work waiting back at Redmont. But this was Tug. He looked up at Bob. "I don't have a horse. What can I do without a horse?" Bob smiled reassuringly. "I'll lend you a horse. I have plenty of retired ranger horses here. Not as spry as Tug, maybe, but good enough for a few days." He saw Will wavering, and he reinforced his argument. "Will, there's nothing you can do here. You'll sit around watching Tug and worrying about him. And he'll know you're worried, and that will affect him." He paused, then added, "It could delay his healing." That did the trick. The thought that he might have an adverse effect on his horse's convalescence was enough for Will. He came to a decision. "I'll pack my gear. Would you get the horse ready?" Bob leaned across the table and gripped his forearm. "Good lad. And I imagine you'll be wanting to say goodbye to Tug." It took an enormous effort to leave Tug in the barn. Will stood, patting his neck and muzzle for some minutes, speaking gently to him. Old Bob stayed out of earshot, giving them privacy. Then, finally, sensing that Will didn't know how to tear himself away, he coughed to attract his attention. "Time to go, Will Treaty. Cormac is ready and waiting for you." Will hugged Tug's neck one last time, gently touching the bandaged wound with a forefinger. "I'll be back in 5 days," he said. Tug shook his head, but it was a more gentle action than his normal, boisterous movement. "I'm not going anywhere." Will's eyes filled with tears, and Tug nudged him with his head. That was a joke. Dashing the back of his hand across his eyes, Will turned quickly and walked out of the barn into the bright sun. Cormac was a chestnut with a light-coloured mane and tail. He was somewhat taller than Tug, but with the same shaggy coat and solid, muscular look that all Ranger horses shared. Old Bob had put Will's saddle and bridle on him and tied the Ranger's camping gear in place behind the saddle. Will judged that he was a few years older than Tug, but he still looked fit and energetic, and he was vaguely familiar. Will had the sense that he had seen him somewhere before. "Will, this is Cormac. Cormac, this is Will," old Bob said as he handed the reins to Will. He slapped the chestnut on the neck affectionately. "He's a good horse, this un. He'll serve you well for a few days. Maybe not as fast as he was 5 years ago, but he'll still run all day for you, and keep going into the next day as well." "That's the way you train them, Bob," Will said with an attempt at a smile. Bob noticed and slapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit, Will Treaty. Off you go then. I'm sure you have all sorts of important work to do. And never fear, I'll take good care of Tug." Will nodded his thanks and went to put his foot in the stirrup. Then he hesitated. "Do I need a permission phrase?" he asked. Bob laughed. "No! Once we retire them, we teach them they don't need a permission word." Will swung up into the saddle, albeit a little suspiciously. He sat for a second or two, waiting to see if Cormac would react. But the chestnut simply turned his head and looked curiously at him. Bob let go a wheezing cackle of laughter. "Don't trust me, eh?" he said. "I told you, he's retired. Now, get going." Will touched his heels lightly to Cormac's side, and the horse responded immediately, moving off at a trot. His gait was different to Tug's, but it was smooth and even. He had a spring in his step too, as if he were glad to be back at work. "I'll see you in 5 days," Will called over his shoulder. Bob waved a hand in acknowledgement, then nodded approvingly as Will, with only the slightest touch, set Cormac into a smooth, easy canter. The horse's tail came up as he ran. "This is fun." "Glad you think so," Will began, and then stopped, surprised that he was talking to his temporary mount. Maybe all Ranger horses responded this way.